I'm Richard Herman. I co-direct the research group at Mershon Center for National Security Studies that focuses on American foreign and military policy. And my co-director is Dr. Peter Mansour, who's also here with us today. I'm very happy today to welcome back to Mershon, if only virtually, M. Taylor Fravel, who is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the MIT Security Studies Program. Taylor has written two books that I've read with great interest. One is called Strong Borders, Secure Nation, Cooperation and Conflict in China's Territorial Disputes, which I still see as a seminal book studying how China manages and deals with territorial disputes, including Taiwan, which is a very principal part of that book, but also compares it with other territorial disputes that China's been involved in. Princeton published that book in 2008. His more recent book is called Active Defense, China's Military Strategy Since 1949, also published by Princeton, which I think goes deep into Chinese doctrine and military capabilities as they've evolved. His other publications have appeared in International Security, Foreign Affairs, Security Studies, and on, the China Quarterly. Taylor's a graduate of Middlebury College. He has his PhD from Stanford. He also has degrees from the London School of Economics and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. And in 2016, he was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow by the Carnegie Corporation. He's also a member of the Board of Directors of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and serves as the principal investigator for the Maritime Awareness Project. I'm sure all of us were watching with great interest the virtual summit between President Biden and President Xi Jinping on Monday. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather have here at Mershon a few days later to talk about the relationship between US and China. So Taylor, it's great to have you back at Mershon. Taylor's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open this up to a discussion, and I hope all of you will raise questions, and I will pass them on. So without further ado, M. Taylor Fravel. Taylor, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Rick. It's really a pleasure to be back. And Mershon holds a special place in my heart because I believe this was the first, I spoke here about 10 years ago. I think it was the first time that I kind of presented the book on military strategy that I was writing at the time and got sort of terrific feedback from everyone. So what I want to do today is, this is really not drawing on any research. It's just my thoughts on sort of the evolving US approach to China, especially whether or not there's a strategy here. I kind of want to try to do three things. First, discuss whether or not there is a strategy towards China. My answer is it's unclear. Second, I want to see what strategy we might infer from the policies adopted so far. And I'm going to make the case for a balancing strategy that, with hints of containment. And then finally, talk about the challenges that this sort of evolving strategy might create. Now, many of these thoughts were developed before the virtual summit. I don't think the virtual summit has necessarily changed much yet. But to paraphrase Zhou Enlai, when he was speaking about the 1968 French Revolution, it's too soon to tell. So we'll just have to wait and see where the U.S. sort of policy goes post virtual summit. But anyway, to sort of kick things off, I think it's a hard question to answer whether or not the Biden administration has a strategy yet towards China for several reasons. In some ways, they're only 10 months into the administration. Confirmations in certain areas are moving slowly. There's no national security strategy yet, no national defense strategy. So in part, we may have to wait until those documents are released, perhaps next month or the month afterwards, to see what the China strategy is, or how it will at least be publicly discussed. But even if there is a strategy, I think one would say that it's unclear. Strategies, ends, ways, and means. We have maybe some articulation of U.S. ends or goals in terms of this idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which I think could be read as a much nicer way of sort of denying China regional hegemony. But certainly in terms of ways and means, there isn't as much yet as one might want to see, given the relationship and its importance. Also, I think, and this was reflected in the virtual summit, but in all the interactions to date, including the talks in Anchorage back in March, Wendy Sherman's visit to China in the summer, and most recently Monday evening, I think the two sides are still trying to set the terms of their relationship and what that means. On the one hand, the U.S. wants to compete, whether it's stiff competition, extreme competition, or intense competition, the adjective changes, but it wants to compete aggressively with China, but also without sort of creating conflicts. It wants to set up, quote, guardrails, which is, I think, a metaphor that works well in the United States. I'm not sure how well that translates into Chinese. And then there's a sort of a long list of issues that that are raised in all of these interactions having to do with human rights, Taiwan, Hong Kong, East China Sea, South China Sea, and so forth. And so that's sort of the U.S. approach. The China approach has been, we have bottom lines that the United States must not cross. Wang Yi articulated these also in July, which basically means don't challenge, our system of socialism, number one. Number two, don't prevent our development. And here's sort of a focus on sanctions and tariffs. And three, don't infringe upon sort of Chinese sovereignty. And so this is how you can kind of see the ways in which I think the two sides have been trying to set the terms. The Chinese kind of went further in July, and they introduced the two lists, the list of U.S. wrongdoings that must stop and the list of individual cases for which attention was needed. Then there may be two more reasons why it'd be hard to divide a public strategy yet. One might be if you have a strategy, you may not want to talk about it publicly. There may be good reasons to do so privately, in part to your adversary, or can't sort of anticipate some of your moves, or it could be that there isn't yet agreement on what sort of the strategy should be. So that kind of wraps up my first point. Moving to the second point, what can we infer from the actions that have been taken sort of by the administration to date? And here I go back to a terrific article that Randy Schweller wrote back in 1999, which I now realize is before some of my students were born, but it's really terrific, and it's sort of how sort of reviews the possible strategies the dominant power can adopt for a rising power. And he goes through preventive war, balancing and containment, bandwagoning, binding, engagement, and buck passing or distancing. I think it's pretty clear when we look at sort of all of the sort of the bucket of policies that have been adopted to date that the U.S. is clearly in this balancing or containment category. And sort of my point is that I think what we're witnessing is kind of a partial or incomplete balancing that stresses some tools of statecraft over others. This could also be viewed perhaps as containment in Kennan's original formulation in terms of preventing the further expansion of another power, but it's not containment if that's sort of code for retaining U.S. primacy or perimeter defense where every kind of Chinese gain may be rebuffed. Though I think when challenged with a balancing approach, it could sort of morph into a more hard-edged containment approach. And so if this is a balancing approach, right, we'd expect to see internal balancing at home and external balancing abroad. And I think, in certain areas, we do see this is how the Biden approach has been evolving. On the domestic front, you have a host of infrastructure spending bills, technology bills. Schumer's just put his bill back in the hopper. The whole idea of Build Back Better. Some of this is explicitly framed around China. Some of it is not, but I think all of it does sort of help bolster U.S. Economic competitiveness and sort of longevity, right? So would clearly be linked to dealing with a rising power, and of course it's a critical, important step, right? Internal balancing must come first, and then we can start looking at areas where internal and external balancing overlap. So on the military and defense side, I believe the Defense Department was the only agency that actually conducted, or at least publicly announced, a policy review, which presumably was part of an effort to further align the department around China. China is now officially described in almost every press conference, right, as the pacing challenge. And so clearly, right, China has been elevated in how DoD thinks about its task. And so presumably resources are going to flow to this on the internal balancing side. And then you see this effort to sort of rebuild sort of military relationships, lots of high profile visits to Southeast Asia and Singapore in particular, including the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, and most recently the Commerce Secretary. And when Austin went to the region in July of 2021, he also focused on renewing the Visiting Forces Agreement with the Philippines. We see a steady tempo of freedom of navigation operations and transits in the Taiwan Straits, which are really intended to sort of signal U.S. resolve, sort of going above and beyond what you would just expect from a freedom of navigation operation. We also see an increased tempo of joint exercises in the area. So recently, there is an exercise involving carriers from the United States, from the UK, as well as vessels from Japan and Canada in sort of late September, early October. And just, I think yesterday, it was announced, right, that the United States and Japan were conducting an anti-submarine warfare exercise in the South China Sea, right, not in the East China Sea. So that's pretty significant. But the most significant element here, of course, is the trilateral agreement, AUKUS, between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to build nuclear-powered attack submarines. I believe we can talk more about the agreement. It also includes aggregating capabilities in other ways, and perhaps this agreement, because the subs won't be delivered for maybe 2 decades, it's really as much about the journey as it is the destination, and the submarines provide a goal around which deeper cooperation can be built. So this could be viewed as kind of really trying to put in a counter on China's southern flank and have some leverage on access points from sort of the South China Sea and the Pacific into the Indian Ocean. And so militarily, it really, lots of what has been done so far does look and feel like a balancing strategy. I think the same could be said on the diplomatic front. You had this initial effort to re-engage with allies across the board. And then as we moved into the summer, the Biden administration really focused on placing China on the agenda of important meetings with different groupings, including the G7, NATO, and the U.S. EU meetings, which stability in the Taiwan Straits was mentioned for the first time, I believe, in all 3 joint statements. And then you had similar statements appearing in bilateral context with Japan and with South Korea. And so clearly this is an effort to sort of focus the allies diplomatically as much as militarily. As I mentioned, right, you had the Vice President visit Southeast Asia, including many of the same countries Austin visited in the summer of 2021. And then perhaps most importantly here, the elevation and nascent institutionalization of the Quad, which includes Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. And here it's not really a collective security organization that's a proto-NATO, but rather a diplomatic grouping meant on providing public goods in the region to challenge many of the public goods that China seeks to provide, or to provide an alternative, especially in the area of infrastructure and in vaccines, sort of among others. I think where the balancing approach is imbalanced, or why it's partial, would be that on the economic front, it's much less clear in which direction the administration will go, and there are lots of countervailing pressures and incentives here. So on the one hand, you have the maintenance of the tariffs and the trade war from the Trump administration. You have an expansion of the entities list and export controls that target either military-linked firms or certain high-tech sectors that the United States is particularly worried about. You have infrastructure initiatives coming out of the G7 and the Quad, which sort of look as if they're meant to sort of have some response, provide some response to the Belt and Road Initiative, and then perhaps most importantly, greater coordination with Europe through the recently established Technology and Trade Council that was stood up about a month ago. But on the flip side, right, there's no clear approach to tariffs in the trade war, except that it's now going to be focused upon. I think the speech by Catherine Tai at USTR was disappointing to many people because it didn't really have a vision for how the United States was going to play a role in sort of the region's economic architecture, except for this floating of a digital services agreement. But I think the real issue is, I'll get to this later, right? It's very hard for the U.S. to join any free trade agreement anymore because it would certainly never be approved in Congress. And so there's going to need to be a workaround to sort of be relevant economically, or to be as relevant as possible economically in the region, as well as diplomatically and militarily. So all this kind of sounds like a a proto or a nascent balancing strategy, and where I think it has other elements, sort of is on the in terms of ideology, on the ideological front. And so I would just make a few points here. I think first, there is like this brewing battle over systems of governance, and it's sort of the great power equivalent of who wore it better. And it's really becoming ideological. Now, this is clearly a matter of legitimacy for the CCP, because their legitimacy is based on performance and nationalism, and those are even increasingly fused, perhaps, than it is for a democratic system like the United States. But this does suggest that, like, we're moving beyond simply sort of checking a rising power, but also trying to shape its domestic politics, or to compete specifically in terms of political systems and political ideas. I think secondly, you have an emphasis, especially I would say through the end of October, before the virtual meeting between Biden and Xi, on sovereignty issues as the main concerns that the U.S. has with China, and the main challenge that China poses to U.S. interests, and the quote rules-based international order. And so the litany of issues raised would almost always be the following: it would be Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, sort of East China Sea and South China Sea. And these are all areas either where China is sovereign, although its governance or its approach is under stress or objectionable, as is the case in Xinjiang, or areas where sovereignty has been contested, in some cases for quite a long time, which would include certainly Taiwan and the island disputes in the East and South China Seas. So the U.S. has taken actions in some of these areas, including sanctions against officials over the national security law. But again, it does bear on this question of legitimacy for the party. And most important here is Taiwan. And I won't spend much time now, although happy to do the Q&A. But I would say that from Beijing's standpoint, starting from about the last year of the Trump administration and continuing the Biden administration, there's been this steady slicing of the salami of the U.S. one China policy, to the point where only a few weeks ago, the foreign minister, Wang Yi, called on the United States to have a real one China policy and not a fake one China policy. And even Xi Jinping, in his meeting with Biden, saying that whoever plays with fire may get burnt. It was a bit more politely framed in terms of not directly pointing the finger at the United States, but talking about a few actions that have been taken. But nevertheless, clearly China believes that the United States has been pursuing a change, and I'm very happy to talk about the reasons sort of in more detail. But from China's standpoint, right, Taiwan is the foundation or the basis upon which normalization between the two countries was negotiated and then realized throughout the 1970s. And so if, as Beijing may see it, that the United States is moving from a one China policy to a de facto one China, one Taiwan policy, this would be upsetting the basis of political relations between the two countries. And I think it's generated a lot of concern in China. And I think this is an area where the administration has tried to balance, on the one hand, sort of showing that it is very willing to be tough on China, even on important issues, but perhaps lacking some of the reassurances regarding the specific issue, given how important it is to the leadership in Beijing. So mostly balancing, but some things that move beyond balancing, or issues that are not directly related to balancing. So this brings me to my third point and final point, right? This is a balancing strategy. I think it faces many challenges. One I've already sort of signaled, it's imbalanced. So externally, this absence of an economic component or a robust economic component gives the appearance of an approach that is really dominated by the military instrument of statecraft. And that could lead to a much more competitive U.S.-China relationship. But if we look beyond East Asia, where China is most able to generate influence is not through its global military reach, but through its global economic reach. And so in some ways, the real competition where the United States to be most focused, sort of outside of East Asia, is economically, but that does not appear to be an element of the strategy to date. I also think if it is more militarized, right, it's going to make it harder for states to balance ties, especially in the region with both Beijing and with Washington. It may accelerate this process of forcing countries ultimately to choose sides. and therefore it's also problematic. And then finally, I think there may not also be or one reason why the economic piece might be missing is that there may just not be consensus within sort of the relevant stakeholders in the United States, whether it's Wall Street versus manufacturing versus technology companies and so forth. Another challenge is that working with allies, sort of the mantra of this administration, is often easier said than done. They're critical in any balancing approach, especially when we're thinking about external balancing. But not all U.S. allies may view the threats and challenges from China in the same way. For example, many of them, especially those in Europe, don't face direct military threats, but they do face much more pressing economic threats. And then when ad hoc groupings are formed like AUKUS, you can strengthen some relationships, particularly the U.S.-Australian relationship, at the expense of ties with other allies, in this case, most notably France. And so I think this is just a pretty significant challenge of implementation. A third area here, a third challenge here, right, is that Congress, I think, effectively removed some options from Biden's toolkit. And these appear as if they're going to be permanent conditions for the foreseeable future, right? So the economic component of a balancing strategy, if it were to sort of rely more on more actively participating in the regional economic architecture and joining agreements like the CTPP, right, that's going to be much more difficult to do if you know that Congress basically will not ratify it. And even this Congress, which is quite united around China, may still find itself divided around free trade or trade agreements. Also, Congress will not ratify agreements like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which are, of course, critical elements of the rules-based order. And even though the U.S. abides by it, I think its position would be strengthened, right, if it was a more active participant of that treaty and others. And then finally, there's also an interesting element in terms of sort of defense spending. I mean, the real military challenge in the region that China poses is based upon its sort of evolving air and naval forces. Yet Congress might find it very hard to reorient defense spending away from the Army towards the Navy and the Air Force in ways that are needed to really sort of maintain a balance of power in Asia because of all of the various vested kind of congressional interests. Now, these are all sort of challenges of implementation, but I'm also worried about sort of the non-balancing elements that I mentioned that Beijing may view as sort of more antagonistic, and that in some ways sort of the congressional sort of bipartisanship over China also exacerbates. I think there's firstly, right, a heightened risk of a conflict over Taiwan. The steady erosion of the one China policy bears directly on the party's legitimacy in China, and there is a breaking point. And so even if the salami is sliced, at some point I think China will conclude to prevent any further slicing. It will have to take some kind of action. I'm not saying it will invade the island, but I think it would sort of take actions that would increase tensions over the island. It could even include a use of force like seizing, say, Pratas Island, but then it would, I think, sort of rapidly accelerate sort of the more general spiral between the U.S. and China to the point where they're in a much more hostile position. So I think it's helpful, right, for the United States to sort of use support for Taiwan as a way of showing kind of resolve to stand up to China, but it's also potentially dangerous without the appropriate reassurances and sort of clear commitment to maintaining the one China policy. I also think these ideological elements that I mentioned earlier, the sense of competing systems, means that a narrow balancing effort focused on checking power might just much more easily evolve into a more fulsome perimeter defense containment style approach, because in some ways it allows for coalitions to be built more easily. And that suggests that the U.S.-China competition would really take on even sort of more greater sort of horizontal and global dimensions. And so I think balancing, at least in our theory, kind of sound like it's easy to do, but in fact, it requires a lot of skill and a lot of sort of judicious sort of application of the different instruments of statecraft. And I think the role of these sovereignty-related issues in U.S.-China relations mean that it's very tricky and not necessarily a conventional sort of balancing approach. And so I'll wrap up here and really look forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. I see some questions already, and I'm going to turn to them. They mostly deal with Taiwan, but before, I'm going to take the prerogative of the host to ask a question or two. In a recent article, I guess what I'm really interested in is the kind of stabilizers and the cushions that are in the U.S. Chinese relationship that in the past have allowed us to carry on some of these competitive policies, both in the economic domain, because we assumed there were some parameters on what was, I won't call it unthinkable, but very unlikely. And I wonder now, you mentioned in a recent article that one of its ideas is that it should try to prepare itself to win informatized local wars. And you can explain to the audience what those wars might be, but I suspect Taiwan might be one like that. And the question I'm really going for is winning. It was in the Cold War, we didn't really think you could win war other than proxy competitions in third-party places because of the threat of nuclear escalation. And I don't go to China as often as you do, but when I've been there, I've noticed that in a number of conversations with Chinese political academics, I guess is the best word for them, they talk very seriously about maritime war, like this is a real possibility, and that we could see hot conflict here. And so I'm wondering what you think about that. Are the cushions, I mean, both at the conventional and the US has withdrawn from the INF. I don't know if that means that people would deploy low yield nuclear weapons in the region, but are we still fairly certain that we can carry on a fairly aggressive competitive policy with some safe, well, called not safe in quotes, parameters of when it would go military? Or is this very much unlike the old Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, where the threat of military escalation would turn to the use of force that would involve direct U.S. Chinese forces is more likely than it used to be in the Russian American case?
Yeah, thanks. No, great question. There's a lot to unpack there. First, in terms of winning informatized local wars, right? This is sort of the PLA's general strategy. And so it views local wars as conflicts on its periphery, especially when sovereignty is contested. So Taiwan is the most important sort of scenario or contingency here, but it includes the border with India, the East China Sea and South China Sea islands, and so forth. And the shift to local wars actually happens in 1988. And then sort of becomes sort of highlighted further in 1993 and has really been the focus of military strategy since then. And of course, when they talk about their military strategies, they're always designed to win wars. But their military strategies also include something known as strategic guiding thought, which generally has three elements. One is to sort of shape the situation favorably well before war starts. And so you could think that as sort of positioning or shaping operations. Secondly, right, manage and control crises to prevent them from escalating if they have to. And then finally, kind of restraining and winning war if necessary. And here, this idea of restraining war is sort of controlling conventional escalation. And of course, they have to say that they're going to win wars because they're a military and that's their job. Now, this, of course, takes on new meaning as we think about the growing competitive relationship between the United States and China, and the fact that one of these local wars is over Taiwan, and that the United States could intervene, and that could, has great potential to escalate. And in many ways, I think this might be what was different about the Cold War, although please correct me if I'm wrong. But in this case, one of the two major powers has a hugely significant unresolved sovereignty dispute or claim that it cares deeply about, not simply as a function of its sort of relative position in the international system, but for nationalist reasons and historical reasons and other reasons. But it's been sort of more able to sort of wield the military instrument in that particular issue as it's gotten stronger and as the power transition changes. And so I think that's maybe what makes this in some ways so potentially dangerous. At the same time, I don't see China chomping at the bit to fight over Taiwan. I don't see them having confidence in their military capabilities yet to conduct the highest end of high-end operations that would be involved in an invasion or in a force-on-force encounter with the United States. But the last thing I would say is China's always viewed, most of the time in these post-PRC, post-49, right, China has used military force in a fairly calibrated way for political ends. And so I think if something were to happen over the Taiwan Strait, short of an invasion that would force the question of unification, I think it really would be to deter sort of what China would view as further unfavorable trends, whether that's greater trends among sort of the populace or the political leadership in Taiwan towards independence, which I think is going to be a salient issue in the 2024 election in Taiwan, or in U.S. support for Taiwan. And so I don't see them necessarily as sort of gearing up now for an encounter that will rapidly escalate, despite this general strategy of talking about winning informatized local wars, but instead being in a position where they now have much sort of more tools that they can use if they want to try to sort of deter either the United States or Taiwan from taking actions that they believe move against unification.
We have three questions, one from Steve Dritz and one from Xiao Dong Zhang and one from Corrine Miller, that all ask about Taiwan. They wonder whether the United States should take military action if China used force against Taiwan. They're wondering whether we've sent strong enough signals already to deter. And finally, they're wondering why this seems to be becoming more urgent. What are the forces? Is it a changing time horizon issue? Is it domestic forces in China, domestic forces in the United States? What is bringing, it looks like, Taiwan increasingly to a head?
All right, if I don't get to all of those, Rick, please bring me back. I guess I'll start with the first one, with the last one first. I mean, I think a lot of issues have come together. You have a much more stronger and capable China than ever before. This is the strongest, right, and most capable China has been since 1949, especially in a military sense. You have a much greater focus on sovereignty issues in China as well, including, right, the crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong in particular, I think was very relevant to Taiwan, because Hong Kong was meant to be governed under Deng Xiaoping's idea of one country, two systems, as was Taiwan, and the way in which I think Beijing used the national security law, ultimately, I think, from its standpoint, to bring sort of Hong Kong to heel, and to ensure that the protests and sort of discontent in Hong Kong would not lead towards a greater kind of sovereignty or autonomy in any way, sort of indicated to Taiwan, right, that the future with China was even bleaker than they may have already thought. One country, two systems now is no longer an attractive option. And then because of the way in which I think Xi Jinping has elevated nationalism, there's been discontent in Beijing with Taiwan under President Tsai Ing-wen's leadership, and in particular that she has never sort of embraced this idea of the 1992 consensus, which is sort of a way of embracing one China, which had been sort of the situation in a contorted way under Ma Ying-jeou. And so I think from Beijing's standpoint, lots of issues to be concerned about with respect to Taiwan, and I think also from the perspective of Beijing and also from Washington, the sense that U.S. support was growing for Taiwan. I think U.S. support was growing in response to Chinese pressure, but the way in which it has grown, I think from Beijing's standpoint, suggests that there may be less of a commitment on the part of the United States to the one China policy. And so that is, I think, where the situation lies. That said, I don't see China as I was trying to mention in answer to your previous question, on the cusp of taking major military action. And to include an invasion, there's been a lot of discussion in the spring of this year, right, that China is almost in a position to invade, and as soon as it has that capability, it will. I think that is a misreading or misunderstanding of China's approach to Taiwan. I think it's fundamentally a political approach or a political military approach in which sort of military power, military threats play a very important role, but it's not a military dominant approach, i.e. one that is just going to be, that unification is going to be solved as soon as China is strong enough to retake the island by force. Like, the policy from Beijing is still peaceful unification, because the people of Taiwan are viewed to be Chinese and to be compatriots fighting a major high intensity war, and then subduing that subduing Taiwan is not Beijing's preferred way to bring about unification. And so you still see a very careful distinction between the authorities in Taiwan who might be sort of leaning towards independence versus sort of the people of Taiwan. And so what you see is Beijing ratcheting up pressure. This includes military pressure, some economic pressure, some pressure in the information space as a way of trying to deter, I think, Taiwan in particular from going too far, and to perhaps deter Taiwan from seeking greater support from the United States. But this pressure has elicited greater support from the United States regardless, which I think sort of accounts for the spiral that we're in. As to the question is regarding whether or not the United States would take military action against China over Taiwan, I think it would probably depend upon the circumstances under which it involved, but certainly the United States is planning to do that. Again, China is the pacing challenge, as described by the Department of Defense. And so I think that there's a decent chance that, especially in the context of, sort of unprovoked invasion, right, not in the context of sort of a Taiwanese pursuit of independence, that the United States would become involved.
Thank you. Just to clarify, if the United States is shaving the salami on the one China policy, is that consistent with trying to deter China, or are there other ways that we can both signal support to Taiwan, deter China, and not endorse more strongly Taiwanese security through sort of our, I won't say violation, but our what you mentioned, the Chinese leader called a fake one China policy?
Well, I think what's been lacking, at least in sort of these last 10 months with respect to Taiwan, has been, at least in public, and again, it's hard to know what is being said in private, but in public, right, sort of a detailed exposition of what the policy is, right, which is that we maintain unofficial relations with Taiwan, but not official relations, and then what that means for the different ways in which the United States supports Taiwan. And the U.S. has supported Taiwan for a very long time, and that support, is not new with respect to arms sales, and it goes back to 1979 and the Taiwan Relations Act and everything else. But I think what is missing is the sense that of reassurance, right? So I think we're trying to deter Beijing from taking further action by increasing our support for Taiwan, but at least in public, not providing reassurances that we're not going to change the unofficial nature of our relationship. We're not going to endorse sort of a de facto one China, one Taiwan policy. And in many ways, I think this administration publicly has been silent on that question. And so one can look at Blinken's statement about increasing Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN a few weeks ago. The end of the statement said that it would be consistent with the one China policy, but didn't say how. And then when I think Ned Price was asked the following day, what was meaningful participation, there was no real answer, right? And so one could think of an answer with, that one could give to that question that would sort of balance these two elements, which clearly are in tension, but it's sort of that lack of assurances and that lack of, I think, a public commitment to the policy, because I think perhaps, I don't know, the administration might feel it would become unduly, it would be viewed as sort of making some sort of a concession to China, especially by Congress, and thus be sort of criticized further, right? This, I mean, I would say the actions taken to date seem also to be very much focused on kind of preventing domestic criticism of its approach to China, perhaps to ensure the passage of the domestic agenda that Biden has through Congress, but also perhaps to ensure that resolve is being sufficiently communicated from the administration's point of view.
One of my former best students, Matt Cato, is wondering if you can lay out a little more clearly who in the Biden administration is running China policy. He's asking whether Jake Sullivan is doing it. I wonder if you could just give us a scorecard of who you see as the primary advisors on China that President Biden is listening to.
I mean, in theory, his primary advisors are from the National Security Council, including the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell, and those who work on China on the national security staff. I think what you see is perhaps there isn't one person speaking for China. As a colleague of mine remarked, this is not my phrasing, it's his phrasing, but I'll allow him to remain anonymous. I'll just use it, which is that in some ways you have at least Sullivan kind of being good cop and Blinken being bad cop. And so Blinken is always underscoring the concerns, the challenges, et cetera. And then you have Sullivan in a variety of interviews. Occasionally he'll mention the word coexistence, or he'll talk a little bit more balanced way about sort of Taiwan and so forth. And so that's simply what we can observe from the outside. It's not clear if that's a function of a deliberate strategy or if it's a function of the fact that there isn't complete agreement on how to approach China. Certainly, I think it was telling that at the end of the readout, that Sullivan did give those remarks at Brookings to sort of explain what had happened. So it would appear perhaps maybe he is moving to take a more central role. But again, from my perch in the bubble of Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is heavily insulated from Washington, D.C., I think it's hard to tell. But it may be the case that the administration hasn't settled on one person. This could account a little bit for some of the different elements of the policy that we're seeing.
I'm going to combine two questions. One from John Mueller, who's my current colleague at the Mershon Center, who wonders whether you now consider China to be an enemy. And sort of if that's the yin, then the yang is from the former director of Mershon, now at Texas A&M, Charles Hermans, who's asking whether you think recent actions of China is signaling their receptivity to find areas of further engagement with the U.S., agreements on climate, or permitting U.S. banks to operate more openly in China. So the big question is, how do you think about this relationship? Are we adversaries? Are we enemies? How much room for more cooperation is there with China, and so on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, speaking personally, I wouldn't say that China is an enemy. I think looking out at the sort of American foreign policy commentary, I think there are those who do see China as an enemy, and those who see China as a very kind of significant competitor with which we must coexist, with which the United States must coexist. I think that's an important difference, because if you do label someone as an enemy, ultimately your policy should be to defeat them, right? You don't really coexist with enemies if you have sort of the choice to do so. And so I think I guess that's how I'd answer the first part of that question. And clearly, if you look at Congress, right, there are many who I think at least publicly describe China in ways in which one would describe an enemy versus sort of a serious competitor or an adversary in some areas. Now, to go on to the sort of the second element here, I think when Biden was elected, I think Beijing very much wanted to pursue a reset of the relationship from especially the latter half of the Trump administration, perhaps to the Obama administration, and that. I think their expectation was that since Biden had been affiliated with the previous Obama administration, that this would be possible, and very much openly talked about that. And I think they were sort of adopted their own tough positions, perhaps as a way to bring the United States back to that. And so this gets this idea of setting terms, and we would have Chinese kind of scholar commentators talking about the need for a new type of major power, great power relationships, and again, kind of rhetoric from the late Obama administration coming from China. I think what we've seen more recently, especially around the Xi-Biden or the Biden-Xi meeting, is that China has, and the United States have signaled a willingness to talk more about issues that are functional and often global in nature, to include some areas of sort of the global economy, climate change, as well as some areas to sort of make China a bit more attractive for U.S. investment, because this is still a very significant element for them, even with China's dual circulation policy. And so I think China has been trying to signal that it has not yet adopted a hostile posture, or does not yet sort of view the United States as an enemy, even though I think China probably views the United States as a very tough competitor. And so I think these were efforts to try to change the tone a little bit without necessarily changing the substance, but recognizing that there were a lot of issues where, or at least some issues where the two sides could work together that wouldn't necessarily bear directly on those over which they were competing most intensively. And I believe this morning there was an agreement announced to resume the granting of visas to journalists from both countries who had been mutually sort of expelled about 18 months ago.
I'm going to follow up. I'm going to come back to Jim Schnell's question in just a minute, but Barry Keenan is asking whether there are ways that the United States can reestablish trust with China. The question implies that in the Trump administration, the trust of the United States in China declined notably, and that rather than being tough, I guess we need to somehow reassure China. What do you think of that? And do you think there are reassurance moves we should be making?
So I think, the Chinese often talk about the need for strategic trust before anything else can happen. I've always been somewhat skeptical of that approach taken by China because I think what it ultimately means is removing the main conflicts from the relationship. And I think China often means removing it in a way to its satisfaction. And these conflicts, from an analytical point of view, are not going to go away. And so, but I think what the United States can do and did not do in the previous administration is certainly to provide reassurances that the United States doesn't pursue a policy of regime change, right, which is where it was headed, I think, in the last 6 months of the Trump administration. If you recall, all the various speeches that were given, especially by the Secretary of State Pompeo. I think Taiwan is a very important element here. And so the United States can provide reassurances that as the relationship does become more competitive, there are issues that the United States is not going to try to compete over, such as the nature of China's political system, or it's not going to fundamentally alter the one China policy. That might not necessarily establish the kind of strategic trust that China would like, but I think it would at least provide some boundaries or limits. And I think that in and of itself would be a positive development. But I think, and one saw sort of hints of this perhaps coming out of the Xi Biden meeting, and there are pretty extensive readouts from both sides, and I think one can take away from that at least a mutual recognition that they do want to try to bound the competitive elements in ways that do not sort of spin out of control, and that itself, I suppose, is a form of strategic trust, but it's not, I think, the kind of strategic trust that China has often talked about, which is that you won't support Taiwan. I mean, that's in some ways that's what Beijing is looking for, and I don't think that's just realistic. But certainly one can provide greater reassurances with how the United States will interact with Taiwan, consistent with sort of various commitments the United States has made in the past.
I have a question from my colleague Alan Silverman. He actually has a raised hand, and I think I've arranged it, Alan, that you can speak now if you unmute. Why don't you just ask your own question?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I'm not good at this, so thanks for the talk. So I guess it's a follow-up in part on the trust issue. Two-part question, I guess. Intellectual property, spine, concerns over that kind of domain, coupled with what do you see as the prospects and consequences for continued academic exchanges, especially with the population of graduate students in the American universities? Do you see that continuing, diminishing? Will worries about intellectual theft cause us to keep them from coming over? And on the other side, I can imagine a story in which they wouldn't want their students to come over here. But those two issues, intellectual property theft and student exchanges, especially at the graduate and faculty levels.
Great, thanks. Great questions. On the IPR issue, I mean, this has been a huge, I think, thorn in the relationship for quite some time, really going back to the Clinton administration, but was accelerated through a very systematic sort of state-run effort to sort of steal intellectual property from the United States that James Mulvaney and others have documented quite extensively in industrial espionage and designed for both military and commercial reasons. stealing part of the F-35 design, stealing other technologies. And clearly, I think that is an issue that the U.S. Trade Representative signaled, right, would be on the table, I think, as tariffs were being renegotiated. But on the prospect for academic exchanges, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I'm sure many of us in universities have been thinking about. And a lot of different elements to it: student exchanges, faculty exchanges, cooperative projects with colleagues in China. Clearly, this is one of the most important and potentially strongest element of people-to-people ties between the United States and China. And actually, it was an idea that goes back to normalization of Mike Oxenberg, who was a political scientist who studied China, but also served on the National Security Council under Jimmy Carter. I really started academic exchanges as a way of sort of further integrating the societies and increasing familiarity and so forth. And it's been a tremendously successful exchange, I think, especially from a US point of view. If one looks at the number of PhDs from China who come to the United States and then stay in the United States within 5 to 10 years from graduating. It's declined a little bit, but it's really very high. So I think there was a move towards closure in the previous administration that's been arrested. And now I think there's a return to openness, but I think there will be probably, my feeling is there are going to be a few more restrictions than in the past, probably focusing on students who have ties to some of the military institutes or universities in China. But universities are open, science is open. Not as much can be stolen so long as it's being conducted transparently, right? Once the paper, right, the scientific paper is out, the knowledge is out. And I think, again, these collaborations have been very fruitful. But you also hit at another important element. China may not want to send as many students abroad as before, because it may want to try to keep that intellectual capital within its borders. I think in the past, there was a hope that individuals would go abroad and then bring knowledge and technology back with them. And that certainly happened in many cases. And it may also become harder for some folks who have US degrees to get employed in China. And so they may be less inclined to go to the United States in the first place. And this is, I think, sort of a general reflection of the more competitive relationship the United States and China now has. But we did see, most recently, a sort of a rebounding in terms of the visas that were granted to Chinese students, and there's still great universities in America. I still think they're it might not return to the very high levels that we're seeing in sort of 2017 and 2018, but I suspect that the student exchanges will continue, at least certainly under a Biden administration, and beyond that, I'm not sure, right? Because they were, under a lot of stress in the previous administration. And those concerns could come back, although I don't think they're usually warranted in the case of students.
I'm going to get to Jim Snell now, who is an Indo-China cultural advisor at Fort Bragg. And he's wondering what the implications are for our U.S. Southeast Asian relations of the rise of China as you've been describing it.
Well, I think that many of the states in Southeast Asia, would like to have their cake and eat it too, in the sense of they want a deep economic relationship with China, which perhaps until recently was linked to their own country's prosperity. And many of them would also like to have some counterbalance in terms of their security relationship with the United States. I also think you have countries that are very colored by post-colonial nationalism and don't really want to be seen as too close publicly to any major power. So I raised that specifically in terms of sort of basing or access for U.S. military forces. I think there may be countries for whom that's going to be a very sensitive issue, even if some of it happens sort of quite quietly and under the radar. There are occasionally reports that U.S. airplanes are flying surveillance missions out of Malaysia, but that's not something that Malaysia really wants to sort of advertise. And you can see other countries in this situation as well. And so I think it will require some some skill on the part of the United States to determine, what posturing is going to be most effective, or what deployments are going to be most effective in the region, and where they may be most able to do them. Clearly, the Philippines, I think, has the greatest upside potential in the sense of being a treaty ally and having various agreements in place that would allow the U.S. forces access and the history of doing so. But it's also a very contentious history, and U.S. forces, were asked to leave for a reason. And Philippine politics are certainly not my area at all, but do seem to move all across the spectrum. And so the closeness the Philippines might be, or the nature of the relationship the Philippines might be willing to have with the United States, I think will depend pretty critically on who's president. And currently, of course, the current president has, until recently, veered much closer to China than the United States. And so I think it has to be navigated in terms of each individual country. And it's a very tricky situation to follow, especially, or to navigate, especially because I think these countries don't want to be seen as choosing. And one way they might be seen as choosing is if the U.S. presence were to significantly increase in their country.
Taylor, I know you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, and we only have a very few minutes, and I have more questions that we can get to, so I apologize to those we're not going to reach. I'm going to put three questions out, and you pick one.
Okay.
One would like to hear more about China's relationship with India. Another is asking whether the United States should encourage Japan to militarize more so that we would have a more military capable ally. And the last is asking a very different question about supply chains and global supply chains. And can we live without China? Do we have workarounds if the supply chain became compromised? So that's too much and goes in multiple directions. And I know you've only got 2.5, 3 minutes here, but pick one, and I apologize to the two that you don't get to.
So these are all great questions. I'll say one on global supply chains. I mean, we have a global trade structure. I think China is a central part of that, and that won't change overnight, or even in a short period of time. So I think it is what it is. I think on the U.S. and Japan, I think the United States would like Japan to invest more in its military capabilities, principally so that Japan could play a greater role in defending its immediately adjacent areas, and especially naval areas. Japan also has a long history of anti-submarine warfare that stems back to the Cold War and capabilities there that the United States would welcome being enhanced, because I think submarines will be a critical sort of military feature of the U.S.-China competition in the region. At the same time, I don't think the United States wants to see Japan increase its capabilities in a way that sort of allow it to become more independent of the United States. Right? I think it sees Japan very much as supplementing other U.S. capabilities. Finally, on China and India, the border issue that led to conflict in June of 2020 has reached an odd equilibrium of sorts, but I think it's a very unstable equilibrium. So most of the areas have been defused. There's one area where the two countries haven't withdrawn forces. They've created very short or small buffer zones here, by I mean like 3 kilometers or 8 kilometers. The problem is that on either side of these buffer zones, and the reports vary pretty dramatically, but satellite imagery indicates, right, you have significant sort of permanent buildup of forces, which suggests that there could be an even sort of greater potential for escalation if those buffer zones are no longer seen as viable by either side, or one side starts patrolling into them. And so I think that's a really important relationship to watch. I don't think China actually wants to go back to the way things were in June of 2020. I think it realized it really kind of strategically harmed itself by pushing India at least farther away from China, and perhaps more willing to engage in things like the Quad. And so I think it will try to sort of balance the sovereignty issues and these other diplomatic issues, but I just don't know if they'll be successful. There's just a lot of military force along that border, and that in itself is a structural condition that I think makes escalation more likely.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that answer, but thank you for spending an hour with us. I wish you could have done it here in Columbus and we'd be having dinner tonight, but this will have to suffice for now. Thank you, Taylor. It's been terrific.
Well, Thank you, and I do look forward to that dinner.
Okay.
Hold
I'm
you
gonna
to
end.
it.
Good.